I'm Joseph Haldane and I'm the Executive Director of the International Academic Forum, IAFOR, and we're here today at the Asian Conference on Cultural Studies 2014, and I'm joined by the conference chair, Professor Baden Offord, who's a leading expert on cultural studies, sexuality and human rights. Professor Baden Offord, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to ask you how you got involved in the Asian Conference on Cultural Studies and with IAFOR.
Well, I got involved with it because, in fact, I came across the website in 2011, and it immediately was something that drew my attention, because cultural studies is not something you see actually as a discipline so much in Japan, and so I was immediately drawn to become involved with the organisation. And as a consequence, I became involved with the conference the second year, the third year and the fourth year.
And these past 2 years you've been our conference chair, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about this year's conference theme.
Well, this year's conference theme is a really topical one for me, and something I've been interested in for a long time. So it was on borderlands, basically, and we called it borderlands of belonging, becoming and belonging and sharing. And it, in a sense, developed out of the conference we had last year, which was on conviviality and cosmopolitanism, as you may remember. And so the theme developed out of, in a sense, the deliberations we did do last year at the conference. Borderlands is a very compelling subject for cultural studies scholars, because it looks at questions of power, of culture, of identity, and it puts it in a context that is incredibly gives you a great deal of interest, because it affects people's everyday lives. Cultural studies is really something that looks at how people's lives, how their meaning is created in the everyday. Cultural studies in the 20th century, in fact, the great thing about it was that it changed the humanities from, in a sense, being much more science influenced to appreciating and giving a reason for why cultural studies is a critical study of everyday life. So in a sense, it's the new humanities.
Okay. How did you come to be interested in cultural studies, and how did cultural studies take you to Japan?
I was interested in cultural studies after I'd finished my degree in history at the University of Sydney. I'd specialised in Indian studies, Southeast Asian studies, and cultural studies was just taking off in Australia in the mid-1990s. And what attracted me to cultural studies was specifically the fact that it approaches knowledge through self-reflexivity and empirical research. So the combination of being a reflective thinker as a scholar, and what is the position of my knowledge and my activity of being a knowledge producer, how is that in relation to looking at research in field work and empirical research. I was very interested, for example, in questions of social justice and human rights and sexual orientation, and cultural studies gave me the kind of tools, theoretically, practically, to be able to, in a sense, do my research, which I did in Indonesia and Singapore and Australia for my PhD, and I was able to, in a sense, get a very good idea of how empowering cultural studies is as a kind of approach to scholarship. I loved the fact that it was interdisciplinary. I came at the questions that I had through history, political science, through cultural anthropology, through cultural geography, and sexuality studies. So for me, it's been cultural studies is probably the sharpest sort of form of scholarship that I was aware of, that provided you with that capacity to really look very rigorously and robustly into very difficult questions.
Your chair is in Cultural Studies and Human Rights, which is not something that people outside of cultural studies would necessarily think of as something that naturally goes together, if you like. But one of the speakers this morning, Professor Shah from Taiwan, was looking in fact at cultural studies and activism. And I wondered how important has activism been to you in your professional career?
Incredibly important. In fact, one of the ways I would describe cultural studies is it's very much about activist scholarship, because it's got this combination of self-reflexive approaches to knowledge. It suits the kind of inquiry into issues of power. So anywhere there's a question of power, whether it's political or cultural or social, economic, there is this question of how am I positioned as the researcher, as the scholar, a bit like what Professor Shah and the other speakers were talking about this morning, in fact. And in that sense, cultural studies is what I would regard quintessentially drawn towards a kind of active scholarship. So it may not appear to be activist as in, waving flags or whatever it is, but it's about a very careful investigation into questions of marginalisation, of power, particularly at work. Cultural studies basically sees society as power-laden in every facet, like the Matrix. And so the discussion that Professor Shah took up this morning, which was a very insightful talk about marriage migration, she really showed us, she really demonstrated, I think, how from a cultural studies perspective you can unpack the various dynamics around power and identity and questions of belonging for those women who come to Taiwan. It was a very interesting example of being disempowered through through migration, and then the whole process of how to belong in this new place. And it was so layered, wasn't it? It was very, very instructive. Yeah.
Baden, why is IAFOR important to you?
IAFOR is a great space for communication, and there's nothing more important in cultural studies scholarship to be able to communicate in such an environment as this. So IAFOR, for me, has become one of those annual visits to Japan where I can renew my friendships, meet new scholars, to make new connections with people from all over the world, which I've done in this conference already. We have more than 33 countries represented, which is amazing. So it's become almost like an annual sort of nourishment, I suppose, for my own scholarship.
Well, Baden, thank you very much for this interview, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And for you watching, I hope you can also make it to an IAFOR conference in the future.